Well, hi, and welcome to the fifth of our Passion Week devotionals. Today I want to focus in on the very first Good Friday. It's a bit of a unique day, really, because we have two simultaneous events going on in Jerusalem. On one hand, outside of the western wall of the city, at a place called Golgotha, there is a young rabbi by the name of Yeshua ben Yosef being crucified on a Roman cross at the hands of Pontius Pilate. On the other hand, inside the city, in the temple itself, on the eastern edge, we have the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Now, this is a really great point to ask a simple but profound question, and here it is. On what basis do you think the Hebrews, the Jews, thought they were saved or their sins were atoned for? What was the basis of their view of salvation and atonement? Well, if you've been around the Christian block long enough, you may well be under the impression that it was on the basis of their good works. They thought that if they kept the law, they would be saved. And what I want to say to you is that view, culturally, historically, archaeologically, is wrong. The reality is actually this. The basis of the Jewish understanding of salvation and atonement was solely in their identity as children of Abraham. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that. See, in Genesis chapter 15, God made a covenant for all time with Abraham and consequently his offspring and their offspring and their offspring. And this covenant was sealed by a blood pact between Abraham and God. If you turn up Genesis 15, you'll see it. It's really interesting. God turns around to Abraham and he says, I want you to bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove and a pigeon. And so off goes Abraham and he returns. And then we're told that Abraham, without any instruction from God, cuts all these animals in half. Now, what on earth is going on there? Well, it's really simple. When God said to him, take these animals, Abraham knew exactly where this story was going. And what he was doing by cutting the animals in half and placing the birds opposite each other was that he was setting up for a blood covenant. Now, in the ancient world, many people made blood covenants. And normally what would happen is you would take an animal, you would cut it in half, so you would kill it, you would arrange the halves paired off against each other with a dip in the ground in between, and the blood of that animal would sit in that impression or that dip in the rock or the ground. And then both parties would walk through the blood. Firstly, the greater party in that blood covenant or that pact, and then secondly, the lesser party. And the deal was this: whoever broke the covenant would die. So if you're the one who made an agreement with someone else and you sealed it in blood like that and you broke the agreement, then the other person had the right to kill you and tramp through your blood. It's very gory for us to think about, but this is how business was done in the ancient world. Now, what's fascinating is in this story, God tells Abraham to take these animals, and he does, and then Abraham knows what comes next. He cuts them in half, he arranges them in pairs, and then we're told a deep and dreadful darkness fell upon him. Well, that's a Hebrew idiom which means great fear came upon him. Well, why would that be? Well, he's about to make a blood pact with God himself, who is infinitely perfect, and with Abraham, who infinitely is not perfect. And he knows the moment he steps into that blood, he's a dead man. Well, then this interesting part of the story unfolds, and we're told that two things pass between the animals. First of all, a smoking fire pot. That's the pot that you would put your coals in overnight to keep them warm, so in the morning you could start a new fire. You'd put a lid on to reduce the amount of oxygen they had, and so smoke would pour out of these holes in the side of the pot. So first, this smoking fire pot goes through. Secondly, it's followed by a flaming torch. Now, why is that significant? Well, when you roll the story forward not many chapters and hit the book of Exodus, we discover that God himself is described as dwelling amongst his people Israel in the wilderness in a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud or smoke. This is an image of God himself. These animals have been killed, they've been paired off. A covenant is going to be made between Abraham and God and Abraham. And then God walks through once as the greater party, and he then walks through again representing the lesser party. The imagery is profound. God is saying to Abraham, this day I make a blood pact with you, and if you break it, I will pay the price. 2,000 years before that Passover when Jesus died, that was God's message to Abraham and Abraham's seed. Now what's interesting is those 5 animals that were listed, the heifer, the goat, the ram, the turtle dove and the pigeon, they go on to be the animals that underpin the Hebrew sacrificial system. If you read Leviticus in the opening chapters, you can see how each of those animals was used as a burnt sacrifice. We're also told in Exodus chapter 29 and verse 38 and forwards how every day the Jews were to sacrifice 2 lambs, one in the morning and one in the afternoon or the evening. Every day. Now, why was that? Well, God on a daily basis was reminding his people about the blood pact with Abraham. And every day that the Jews went to the temple in Jerusalem to observe those sacrifices, they called it the hour of prayer, every time that they went up, in their heart they would be saying, God, don't forget your blood promise to Abraham, because we are his seed. And so that first Good Friday, in the Jewish system of religion at that time, we have documents that tell us that the early sacrifice began at about 6 a.m, at dawn as it were, and it would come to its climax at 9 a.m. And then much later in the day, at 3 p.m, there would be another sacrifice of the second lamb. And it was just this simple daily reminder to Jehovah, to Yahweh, God, do what you promised to Abraham. And so it had been a crazy evening. There'd been the joy of the Last Supper and celebrating a feast together, Jesus and the disciples. There'd been the agony in the garden of where Jesus is praying, God, that you would take this cup of wrath away from me, but not my will. It's what you want, Father. The betrayal through a kiss of all things. And then under the cover of darkness, the deepest, darkest part of the night, 3 false trials happen where false witnesses are brought up to testify about Jesus, but none of their testimony bears any semblance of truth. There's Herod, and then finally Pontius Pilate, who really finds no basis for the charge against Jesus, once again cementing that fact that Jesus would be the perfect and spotless lamb. And then Pilate, wanting to kind of keep the peace and satisfy the Jews but be free of any guilt himself, washes his hands publicly and says, take him away. And so he is scourged. He has 40 lashes with a bone and flint and lead whip. And then finally, he is given the patibulum, the crossbeam for the crucifix on which he will die. And he has to walk out of the city. All of this happens just as daylight is hitting. Now, this is a major feast in Jerusalem, and everybody wants to be up at the temple. And so really, from the first thing, pilgrims are pouring into the city from the south. They're coming in through the southern gate at the Siloam Pool so they can ritually cleanse themselves and then make that walk up the pilgrim road. You've heard of the Psalms of Ascent. And they could finally go to the temple and celebrate God and his Passover. But at the very same point that they are pouring into the city from the south, Jesus is being led out of the city to the west to be crucified. The temple would have been humming that day. Everybody was gravitating in, and yet he was travelling out. They all wanted to be there for the 9 a.m. sacrifice, and later in the day for the 3 p.m. Now, they had an interesting way of how these things work. They had a sundial that they used, or if it was cloudy, they would have had a sand timer, just like this. And the idea was that at 9 a.m. and at 3 p.m, whoever was tending the sundial or the sand timer, once that moment was hit, they would look up to the kind of pinnacle of the temple, the ramparts that ran around the temple complex, and there would be a priest or a Levite there with a shofar, and he would blow that shofar. All of Jerusalem would have heard that trumpet blast, and as that trumpet blasts, the lamb is sacrificed. And then again at 3 p.m, the sundial or the sand timer, and at just the right moment, a look, a glance, a wave up to the shofar player who would have blown the shofar. And at that point, the priest in the temple at the altar would have sacrificed the second lamb. I find it really interesting that we're told that Jesus was put on the cross at 9 a.m. And then at 3 p.m, as that shofar blew and the priest in the temple cuts the lamb's throat, Jesus screams out in a loud voice, "It is finished!" And at that same moment, the second lamb in the temple has its throat cut. Jesus perfectly fulfills the prophetic picture of all of those sacrifices that God instituted through Moses. And in those moments when the whole of Jerusalem was focused on God, remember your promise to Abraham. God, don't forget what you promised to our father Abraham. God, on the basis of your blood pact with him, are we saved. In the moment that happens, Jesus dies. Now, a few years ago, there was a big hoo-ha when one of our notable Christian leaders in the UK turned around and said that if the cross was substitutionary atonement, i.e. Jesus died in our place, then that amounted to nothing more than cosmic child abuse. As if God had put Jesus on the cross and Jesus is fighting against it. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 19 says this: in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. In Christ. And that prayer from the Lord's Supper when Jesus sits down with his disciples and then he prays his prayer to God, and he talks about him being in God and God being in him and them being in the believers, the disciples, and vice versa. So in Christ, in that moment, in Christ, God himself was reconciling the world to himself. Jesus said, "Nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down and I will pick it up." There's an important lesson for us in this, and it's simply this, that we so often believe that God's love for us is conditional upon how much of the Bible we've lived out in a particular day, how righteous we've been, what good things we've done, and what absence of bad things we've done. But the very heart of the Jewish system, which Jesus himself came to fulfill, was simply this: God, don't forget your blood pact that you made with Abraham, that when we mess up, you somehow will pay for it in blood. That's what Jesus did for you, and that's what Jesus did for me. And the Father does not sit apart from that rejecting his son. He was in his son, walking that with him. God the Father is not distant in this moment. He's not unconcerned. You know, in Jewish culture, when somebody dies, they practice a thing called Shiva, or sitting Shiva. Shiva is really the number 7, and for 7 days you will mourn with that person. And it is extremely usual in those circumstances that when somebody loses a loved one, they will take their garments by the neck and they will tear them. Because that person that they dearly love has been wrenched from their life, has been torn out of their life. It's a sign of ultimate grief. And I just find it really interesting. There's 2 things that happen when Jesus is on the cross that day. The first of those things is actually that we're told it goes dark. It goes dark. I find that fascinating because Psalm 104 verse 2 tells us that God clothes himself with light. And if in that moment he'd been practicing Shiva, he would have torn that cloak of light. And there would have been no light. It would have gone. And that's what we see at the cross. Secondly, we're told that the veil in the temple is torn top to bottom. This is not from the human end. This was a huge curtain. It's torn from the top. Now, if you think about the temple, in the Holy of Holies was meant to be the Ark of the Covenant, and subsequently, because of that, the very presence of God himself. And so that veil, in one sense, was the clothing that God wore in the temple. And in that moment when Christ dies, God tears that garment top to bottom. He cared about his son's death. He was not dispassionate about it. He was in the midst of that moment. And the reason he was in the midst of that moment is because he loved Jesus. But also, he's in the midst of that moment reconciling the world to himself because he loves us. And our approval rating with God is not based on our worst or our best day. It's based on a promise that he made to Abraham nearly 4,000 years ago. And the Jews held on to that promise. God, don't forget. Don't forget. God, don't forget. Do what you promised you would do for Abraham. And he did that for us. In many senses, it was the most tragic day in all of human history. But it was also the best. Because for all of those years that the Jews had been sacrificing, those sacrificed only really covered over sins. They didn't deal with them. It's a bit like the cleaner who brushes the dust under the rug. The rug covers it, but it's still there. But on that day, that Good Friday, that Passover, 2,000 years ago, God dealt with our sin once and for all. So we don't have to worry about our best day or our worst day. We can just enjoy worshipping him and the righteousness and the peace and the joy that comes from God fulfilling his blood pact with Abraham. Goodbye.